All right, today we're talking all about multiband compressors. Now, I have an entire playlist on dynamics processing, so if you're new to compression, you might want to catch some of those other videos before you hop into this one. But today we're going to get into applying multiband compression and a lot of different examples. They're really powerful tools. They're great in electronic music. They're really good for very hard, crunchy guitars and hard rock. They're typically not as good for softer, more intimate, delicate recordings, but it doesn't mean they can't be used there. They can be really good on vocals, but they can also be a little tricky. But we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the crossover points, because that's a part that seems to get a lot of people hung up about where to set your crossover filters and how that works. And we're going to give you some really good tools for mitigating the phase issues and buildup in frequencies that could occur when you set your crossover points. And I'm going to try to give you a couple simple tips and strategies to navigate that issue. But there's an awful lot to cover here today, so let's get right into it. All right, so we're going to start with the pros and cons of multiband compression. So some of the great things about MB compression is that it can simply be easier and quicker than using a dynamic EQ. Especially the simple 3-band ones, you can a lot of times just slap them on a track and get a great compression and a tone shaping out of them pretty quick and easy. And obviously they offer more control than a standard wideband compressor. They also typically do not use as much CPU than a dynamic EQ, and a lot of multiband compressors offer independent attack controls on the different bands, which can be super helpful because a lot of times you want faster attacks on the higher frequency ranges and slower attacks on the lower frequency ranges. Now, the downside to multiband compression is that in general, they're just not as surgical or transparent as a dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQs are able to get in and do a lot of really fine work. They can better target more specific frequency ranges, and most dynamic EQs are a lot less colorful. They're more transparent, and a lot of multiband compressors are modeling analog gear and they're super colorful. And that can be a good thing and sometimes not. MB compressors also tend to be pretty heavy-handed, so they can compromise the sound really quickly. So you might have to be careful with them and be pretty gentle, but because they're heavy-handed, you can also really smash something and get a really awesome sound out of it if that's what you're going for. But the biggest problem that you typically hear with multiband compressors is the crossover points causing phase issues. Don't be afraid of that. I'm going to give you a couple simple tips to help you navigate that. A lot of times you grab a multiband and you don't have any problems at all, but it is something you just need to be aware of. You just need to know where to set those crossover points and have a couple tools for how you're going to manage it if you do have some phase issues, but we're going to get to all that. But compared to wideband compressors, multibands are awesome for a couple other reasons. They do allow you to compress the mids less. That's really useful because the way the human ear works is that we like to hear more dynamic range in the mid frequencies for our ears to be able to isolate things out and separate things in our heads. So you don't want to ever over squash any mid-range with any kind of compressor, but that's another great thing about multibands is they give you that independent control where you can leave the mids be a little bit more. But that's all the basics I wanted to cover, so let's dial in and start applying some multiband. Now, multiband compressors are ideal for a kick drum. If you've caught my video on internal side chains on compressors, I talked about how useful it can be to not have your compressor overreacting to the low frequencies. A multiband compressor on a kick drum pretty much solves all that problem for you because you can assign the low thud of the kick down where the fundamental is its own band, and then another band for the mids, and then another band for the high mids where the transient cracks out. Now, as far as the right tool for the job, every multiband is different. Some of them give you independent attack and release on each band, and some don't. Like this one does not. This one has 3 attack settings, an auto setting, and it gives you the release control, but it doesn't allow me to set a slow attack on the low frequencies and a fast attack on the highs. So this might not be the best tool for a kick drum. But let's go ahead and give it a try. And what we have to decide now is where to dial in the 3 bands, the low, the mid, and the high. And that's where the crossovers come in. Now, when you're setting your crossovers, you have to decide where the mid band of the compressor stops compressing low frequencies and where the low band starts. And here's my first tip for dialing in your crossovers. What you don't want to do is put the crossover where there's a big spike of energy or where there's a fundamental. So for the kick drum, that's obviously right in this region. So our fundamental here is at about 60 hertz and the first harmonic around 120. And right up here at about 200, we have a nice dip. So this would be an ideal spot to put our low to mid crossover. And then we could set the mid to high crossover right up here around 1K 900. And then the mid band will handle all of the mud in the low mids and the mid range. And then the high band will handle all of this crack and transient of the kick. So here's my low frequency crossover. Let's dial this down to about 200. And the high one, we're going to bring down to about 900. I'm going to leave my knee right in the middle for now. And I'm going to leave my attack setting to normal. And the release is set at 180. And I'm going to dial this back. I'm going to start at about 50. And we're going to see if we need to ease off on that. But we want to try to get a nice thud and recovery here. I'm going to take it out of bypass now. And we'll start compressing the kick. So right there, you can hear that the transient in the highs, I'm not liking that. That's cutting that off too much. So I'm going to change the attack to slow. That brings some of the transient back, and the low still sounds okay. I'm going to go for a little more compression. I'm going to ease off the release. Get a little more of my thud back on the low. And let's bypass it and compare it. Bring it back on, get some makeup gain. You always want a level match so you're not being fooled by just having a louder signal. Bypass. This kick drum has nothing on it, it's just a dry stem. Normally I would always do subtractive EQ and high passing up to the fundamental before I compressed, but in this tutorial we're doing everything as dry as possible so we can just hear these compressors working. Crank up the compressor all the way. We actually need to take the low and high compression that we added and drop those out quite a bit because I don't really like what it's doing. Let's take a listen. And bypass. There we go. And back on. And TriComp also offers us some saturation to get some analog feel. Let's take a listen to adding a little touch of that. Yeah, a little goes a long ways. If I crank it up, dial it back, and we'll bypass, and back on. But that's my verdict. The TriComp is not the right one for this kick drum. If you don't like the sound you're getting out of it, just yank it and try a different tool. This is :MB by Analog Obsessions. Let's do the same approach here. We're going to set our low to mid crossover right around 200. And this crossover, as low as it goes, is 1.2, so this may not work for us, but let's give it a try. :MB here is program dependent, so it doesn't give you threshold and ratio control. The harder you drive it in, the more those go to work for you. But it does give us independent attack and release on all of the bands, but they're all very fast. The slowest the attack goes is 50 milliseconds. So I'm going to set the low one as slow as it'll go. Now the release on :MB is crazy. It goes all the way to 3 seconds, a really long release. And the fastest it goes is 100 milliseconds. For the mids, I'm going to go up to a 30 millisecond attack and take the release down to about 150. And for the highs, I'm going to go with a fast attack at about 10 milliseconds, and we will adjust that in a minute and dial in our transient the way that we want, and I'll go with the fastest release. So let's start dialing in the lows here. Just start increasing the signal. I'm going to go for about 6 dB of gain reduction and do a little makeup. And I'm going to leave the mids alone, just get a little bit of reduction. And let's clamp down on that high transient. And get some makeup gain. All right, and now let's slow down our attack and let some transient through on the high. Now if I speed up the attack on the low, it just kind of wrecks it. I want it as slow as possible, and I'm wishing it went slower. So you can hear it really changes the kick drum. So if this is a sound that you like, great. That's pretty quick and easy to dial in, but you might want to yank this and try something more transparent. Now, if this multiband was causing us any kind of weird frequency issues where the crossovers happen, you could go in here and listen around and see if it's doing anything that you don't like. And I'm going to get to this more in a second, but one of the ways you can rectify that is with some subtractive EQ at the crossover point, and that seems to work really nice. It was easy to dial in. The real question is do you like the sound? Because it's changing the sound of the kick drum a bunch. But if not, just try a different one and keep moving. And if you decide that you don't have a multiband compressor that is transparent enough, then just try a dynamic EQ. Because you can do the same thing with a dynamic EQ and get a much more transparent result. But the reason a lot of these are so popular is because they change the sound. But that's really a matter of personal taste here. Do you actually like the way this sounds on this kick drum? It's got a lot of crack and snap, and if that's what you're going for, then this is really helpful. And then you could use the outputs, these makeup gains, as basically a 3-band EQ to fit this into your mix. Another great thing about this plugin is it gives us independent dry and wet controls for all 3 of these. For example, if we blend the low end, now that we have it super compressed, and we'll take it down to about 50-50 wet dry. And that sounds really nice. Bypass. Back on. And we could do the same for the high transient. If we really crush this transient, which I don't care for that sound right there, that's way over compressed, but now let's blend it. That's starting to sound pretty good. And we could just leave all these wet, and down here we could just blend the entire signal. So that's our dry kick drum, and let's start blending in our parallel compression now that things are really over compressed and colorful. Yeah, and right at there at about half-half, that sounds really good. So there we've over-compressed the kick drum, added a lot of color, and we've blended it in 50-50 with the dry signal. And let's bypass. Yep, but it's all kind of personal taste. Both of these multibands are really cool, and if that's giving you the sound you like, great. But if you don't like the sound you get, it might not be you. You might have your crossovers set right, you might have your parameters dialed in smartly, and you still might not like what it's doing to your sound. So just yank that tool and try another one. But let's go ahead and move on to the acoustic and take a look. Now, my go-to for an acoustic is not a multiband compressor. I typically go for a dynamic EQ, but let's give this a shot. This acoustic doesn't give us the option of setting our low crossover where there's no fundamentals. The fundamentals that are being played here are anywhere from 80 hertz all the way up to about 400. So there's no way to isolate out the lows from the low mids with the crossover that's not going in an undesirable place. So in that case, what do? You could go down here to this 130 where there's already a dip here and put your first crossover there. And then we could go up to about 1K, 1.2 and put our next one there. But I don't think that's ideal because in the 2 to 300, maybe even up to 400 range, this is the muddy and boxiness range. And ideally, you're going to want independent control of this range. And that brings me to my point, which is a 3-band multiband compressor is probably not the right tool for the job on an acoustic. Now, this is Multiband Dynamics, which comes with Studio One. This is a super powerful tool, and this is what I would do for an acoustic, but this is a bit of a teaser. This plugin is complex, and it really deserves a video all to itself. But that said, if we were going to try a 3-band on the acoustic, then I would set the low right here at around 360, 350, and then I would want to get all of the high brittle stuff under control in its own band. So I would probably aim for somewhere around 2.5 or 2K. So we're going to go with about 350 and 2K, and that's where we're going to set our crossovers, and we'll see what we can come up with. Now I'm going to go for a slow attack. I'm going to go for a soft knee. And I'm going to set the release right around 100 milliseconds for now. Dial in the compression. I'm going to go with a little bit faster of a release there. So if we were causing ourselves any weird issues with the crossover, it would be right around 250, because the lower frequencies are way more prone to issues with the crossovers than higher frequencies are. So this brings me to tip number 2. So since we had to pick a crossover point where there are fundamentals and we could be giving ourselves some issues, we picked the 250 because it's boomy and boxy, and we already planned on doing an EQ dip there. So if this crossover point was causing us any issues, then we can follow up the compressor with some subtractive EQ in that area to help mitigate that problem. Whenever you have to put a crossover point in a less than ideal spot, you can follow it up with some subtractive EQ. So I could go ahead and do a little bit of a dip here at 250 where that crossover is. Now, if you do the subtractive EQ before the compressor, it might not be necessary after the fact. It all depends, but just so you're aware of that, that's one of your best tools for handling crossover point issues with multiband compressors is subtractive EQ on that crossover point. Which means that logically, you might as well try to place the crossover point in a spot where you already would like to do some subtractive EQ. But at the end of the day, do we even like this on this acoustic? Let me bypass it. And back on. Yeah, I'm not a fan of it. I don't like how unnatural it's making the high-mid sound. And I could keep messing around with this, but that's why my go-to for an acoustic is not trying to use a 3-band multiband. I would go with either a dynamic EQ or a multiband dynamics like this. To me, that is a way nicer sound than we were getting out of the TriComp. Let's bypass. And back on. Yeah. So the right tool for the job. Now, you might not have access to something like this, but anyone has access to Nova, a free dynamic EQ, which I have a whole video on. But now let's get off the kick drum and take a listen to a little bit of a mix. These are all very minimally processed, and we're just going to try to get as much as we can done with just different multiband compressors here. All right, we're going to start with the bass. And this dynamic EQ is side-chained to the drum bus, but that's all that's going on in here so far. So here's the bass with the colon MB bypassed. And we'll turn it on. So right now, the low crossover on the bass between the lows and the mids is at 50 hertz, which is not where we want it. We want to get it above the fundamentals of the kick and probably above the fundamentals of the bass, which is going to be, since this is all low register stuff, if I take this up to just under 200, and I'm going to go ahead and squash the low end down to about 9 dB and bring up some of the makeup gain. And as you can hear, there's nothing going on in the high, which is fine. But because this is a super aggressive, colorful multiband, if I go ahead and crank this up so I'm getting some gain reduction, I can actually get some distortion out of the high end that is not there in the original bass, and I can manipulate it with the attack and release. See, if I slow down the attack, the gain reduction goes away except for that spike at the end, and the distortion goes away. But if I speed up the attack, now it's saturating everything above 2200. And when I speed up the release, now I have a nice little crunch going on in the high end that I might actually want. And the reason it's doing that is because this is such a colorful, saturating multiband. So let's pop this back in the mix and take a listen. All right, I'm going to bypass the multiband on the bass. Back on. And if we solo out just the drum and the bass. Now this bass still needs to be sidechained to the kick, but that's not the point of this video right here. But let's say I did want to just get a little bit more out of this bass. I would just increase the low end output. There we go, that's thumping. This is a quick, easy one to use. It's just really aggressive, really heavy-handed, and it can wreck your stuff really fast. But if you're doing electronic music, that might be exactly what you have in mind. Another classic multiband out there is OTT, and this is a free version that's available for us. OTT is famous for being so aggressive. It really smashes things, and it also combines upward and downward compression, which is really cool. That can be used to extend reverb tails and stuff. OTT has the built-in disco smile output, meaning that the highs and the lows are outputted higher than the mids are by quite a bit. And this version of OTT does not give us independent attack and release controls, but it does give us this depth control, which basically dials that in. The attack and release go hand in hand. This is simple. It's just a handful of controls, and it's really fun to use. And if you're not trying to do anything gentle or subtle, then this is a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and crush these drums with this. I'll start with it bypassed, and then we'll bring it on. Let's bring the bass in too. Let's turn the drums up a touch, and we'll bring on OTT. And right away, I want to turn down some of the high, turn up some of the mid. And in this one, when I turn the knob to the right, that is decreasing the attack time, and you can hear the transients going away. And we'll slowly dial it in here and get as much snap and punch coming through as we like, but we're gonna do this in the context of the mix. You take it back out, and we'll dial it back in. Yeah, that's nice. Now let's do a little OTT on this synth. Listen to this synth and listen to the reverb tails and the delay coming at the end of it. That stuff fades away pretty quick, and with OTT on, we're going to crank up the upward compression, and now listen to it. This is one of the cool sound design things you can do with multibands, especially the ones that offer the upward compression, is you can increase those reverb tails and bring out the subtle things that are way in the background. Yeah, very cool. Let's hear it in the mix. All right, let's turn the highs up and the lows up. Yeah, very cool. That's a bit over the top, but it's a lot of fun. But OTT is really cool for sound design, for squashing sounds, which is why it works so good in electronic music, but it's not good for every application. I wouldn't put this on an acoustic guitar. It's really not what it's for. But just so you know, this is there. If you don't have this, it's free and it's a lot of fun. Now let's take a listen to this arpeggiated synth. And let's go ahead and dial in our crossovers. Let's take it up to, say, about 270. So the low end is going to catch all that. And then the highs I'm going to take down to about 3 or 4K. Pretty hard knee here. And I'm going to increase the attack to fast. So this is going to be a little bit more colorful and aggressive. So let's go ahead and crank that up and take a listen. I'm going to speed this release up a bit. Very cool. I'm going to increase the low compression a little bit. Yeah, that's getting us a little bit of a rhythmic pulsating there, which is pretty cool. And a cool thing about TriComp is it offers its own independent saturation, which is really strong. So a tiny touch can go a long way, but take a listen. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, very cool, but very easy to dial in. A really steady, aggressive gain reduction and do some tone shaping pretty quickly and easily. Let's dive into a different mix here, and I want to show you a few more examples of how some things can be really quick and easy and effective with a multiband, and some things not so much. So we're going to start with the heavy guitars here. There's 4 of them. Let's take a listen to them in order. One of those is panned hard left, one hard right, and then the other two are panned about 3/4 left and right. Now, they were really easy to dial in with TriComp, and there's nothing on any of these guitars except some high passing. I left all that off so we could really just hear the effect of the multibands. But here is the guitar bus dry with this bypassed. And then I'll bring it on. And in the mix. And bypass. Back on. Yeah, this was very simple to dial in. The low-mid crossover was set at about 250, and even if you lower this down to about 150 or 100, it still works really well. And then between the highs and the mids is set at 4.2K right now. The normal attack setting works pretty well. I do think you could do a better compression job on this bus if you had independent attack controls. But TriComp worked really well on this bus. It was quick and easy to dial in. I left the knee in the middle, and I left a really fast release because it's such an aggressive, fast sound. But I want to show you the mid to high crossover here and what it does in the mix. So what I'm going to do is adjust it from the 4.2 down to about 1K and take a listen to the difference. So you can hear that the guitars get quite a bit darker and they go in the background a bit more. If I decrease the amount of extra compression on the highs, a bit more of the presence comes in at the top end. But if I increase that compression and raise the mid to high crossover back up to the aggressive range of about 4 or 5K, then that changes the tonal quality quite a bit as well. And now if I decrease it up here with it set at 5K, then I lose a lot of definition. Where you set the mid to high crossover and how much extra compression you dial in or let through really changed the tonal quality up there. But all in all, simple, easy. TriComp worked really, really good on this guitar bus. But I want to show you the Colon MB on this guitar bus now. So here it is dry. And just for reference, once more with the TriComp turned on. All right, back to dry. And now I'm going to turn on the Colon MB. Now you should be able to hear an issue going on in the left and right channels. You can hear like there's a mid-side interference going on. There's some warbling around between the left and right, and it's not very rhythmic, so it's really noticeable. Colon MB was really struggling here, and after I adjusted the crossovers and the attacks and releases, none of that was alleviating this issue. But now take a listen to what happens when I drop this bus into mono. Almost all of that issue is gone. And back into stereo. And what I found out by doing that is that Colon MB is having a hard time with the 4 sources that are panned differently, especially with the one panned hard left and one panned hard right. And this plugin doesn't offer any mid-side options at all. I wouldn't really call it a phasing or a chorusing effect, but there's something going on left and right and center, and I just dropped it down into mono. And that's a really great reference tool. But that simple trick told me that this is just simply not the right multi-band compressor for the job. But TriComp did really good. Those big, heavy, crunchy, distorted guitars, that is a great application for a simple 3-band multi-band compressor. Quick and easy to dial in, worked great. Now, TriComp also did pretty good on this drum bus. But here's the thing with this drum bus. The issues that I was having dialing this in is if I want the low band of the multi-band compressor to just be isolated to the kick, so the low to mid crossover set around 112, that only worked if I was letting the low fundamental of the snare be caught by the mid frequency band and the high cracking transient be caught by the high band. I could not let the mid band catch both the low fundamental of the snare and the high crack transient of the snare without it ruining my transients, no matter how I set the attack. And let me show you what I mean. We're going to take a listen. We're going to adjust these crossover points so the low also catches the fundamental of the snare, and we're going to adjust the high so it does and doesn't catch it. Take a listen. So there I've raised the low crossover to where it's also catching the fundamental of the snare. If I raise the high crossover up to about 6, 7K, it's wrecked the transient on my kick drum. And it doesn't matter how I set the attack. The only attack that works very well at all is the slow. And this is with a really fast release. Now, if I decrease the mid to high crossover, that works pretty good, but the snare sound isn't working for me so well anymore. So I wanted to show you this because with an active hard rock drum bus like this, it was doable with the 3-band, but it wasn't ideal. Now, let's compare that to having 5 bands. This gave me so much more control, and I was able to use it as a tonal shaper to drive into the mix where I wanted really well. This is just a far superior tool. It's not always necessary, but it is very helpful. And I'll bypass it. Back on. And I have to say, it was the same thing for the lead guitar. I was not able to find a 3-band that did what I really wanted for this guitar in this genre. Let me bypass this. Back on. Yeah. Multi-band compressors are really awesome in a hard rock genre like this, and the 3-band ones, they are quick and easy to dial in, but they're just not suitable for every application. A lot of times having more bands is going to be really advantageous to you. But like I said, this plugin needs a tutorial all on its own. But there you have it. That's a good introduction to multi-band compression. And I wanted to make sure that I showed you lots of examples of things that didn't work out so great and struggles that you might have, and hopefully you got a lot out of that. And I especially want you to know that if you're playing around with multi-bands and they're wrecking your sound or they're causing you difficulties, that it might not be you. It could be the plugins. It's just simply that not every multi-band is good for every application. And yes, those fancier plugins like the FabFilter multiband and the Presonus multiband, they are super helpful. They are really powerful tools, but you don't need them to get a great sound on everything. But there are going to be, unfortunately, some sources where it will just be really helpful to have something like that. But that will be the topic for a future video. Thanks again for everyone who participated in the community poll. A lot of you wanted to hear about multiband, so I wanted to do an in-depth tutorial for you. I hope you liked that. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one.